Mark and Alicia's laughter echoed through the quiet night as they drove down the empty suburban street. The world outside seemed peaceful, perfect even. Alicia, her hand on her swollen belly, glanced out at the streetlights blurring past and smiled. "I think Oliver sounds nice," she said softly, eyes sparkling. "Our little one could carry that name, don't you think?" Mark gave her a side glance, grinning, though his mind seemed to drift off for a second. "Maybe," he said, his voice warm, but there was something lurking behind his calm demeanor tonight. The usual joy from the thought of becoming a father was there, but a nagging sense of unease wouldn't let him rest. He'd felt it ever since they'd moved here. Too quiet, too perfect, the kind of place where things could stay hidden, good and bad. Alicia noticed the shift in his energy but didn't press it. Instead, she pushed the thought aside and leaned her head against the cool window. They had fought too hard for this. To make a life for themselves in a new town. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. For tonight, at least, it was enough. Until the police lights hit the rearview mirror like a shot to the chest. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. Alicia's breath caught. The sirens screamed their dominance through the night, and suddenly, all that peace, all that hope, they were gone. As they pulled to the side of the road, Mark's heartbeat echoed in his ears. He wasn't even speeding. "Stay calm," he whispered more to himself than to Alicia. "It's just a random check, nothing to worry about." But Alicia didn't respond. She clutched her stomach tighter, the grip of fear starting to carve deep lines into her face. Mark's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching the flash of the officer's silhouette growing closer. There was something sharp, aggressive in the way they moved toward the car, their footsteps pounding into the quiet. Mark had lived through enough to know when trouble was coming. It wasn't in the attitude of the officer walking up to his window. It was in the gleam in the cop's eye, cold, calculated, dismissive. "Driver," the officer barked before Mark could even roll down the window. "Step out of the vehicle." Alicia's hand shot out, gripping his arm as if to anchor herself. "Mark, don't." "I'm calm," he assured her softly, forcing his fingers to relax. The officer was still standing outside, silent, waiting. Mark slowly opened the door and stepped out, as directed. His posture was confident but cautious, too cautious. He didn't know what to expect, a polite exchange, or something far worse. "What do you think you're doing around here?" the second officer demanded, the hostility rolling off his tongue. Mark swallowed hard, his pulse jumping. He knew the game now, the kind of game the world had tried so hard to play on him, and on others like him. "I'm just driving home," Mark answered, his voice steady. He could feel Alicia's eyes on him, could feel the weight of every muscle in her body, stretching with worry. But the officer wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "I didn't ask where you were going. I asked what you're doing here. You don't belong in this part of town." Mark's eyes narrowed. "I live here," he replied. The edge in his voice was harder now, a kind of defiance threatening to crack the silence that had fallen between them. The first officer, taller, more authoritative, leaned in close, the pungent scent of stale coffee on his breath. "Do you live here?" "I don't think so." Alicia's voice cut through the tension before she could stop herself. "We're just coming from the park. We haven't done anything wrong. Please." Her hands were shaking in her lap, and it didn't escape either officer's notice. But the taller officer, the one who had spoken first, didn't listen. His eyes shifted cold and hard toward Alicia. The humor that had barely been there before vanished into something darker. He shifted his weight on the balls of his feet, his fingers twitching on his belt. "Ma'am, don't make me tell you how this works. You're here because you know you don't fit in." Mark felt his chest tighten. Alicia's breath hitched in her throat, but her jaw was set with that kind of fiery determination Mark admired so much in her. I said, "Leave her out of this." Mark's words came out far stronger than he intended, the anger bubbling up like an inferno in his chest. The second officer sneered and squared up to Mark. "You don't talk to me like that." Suddenly, without warning, the officer shoved Mark, hard, against the side of the car. It happened in a blur. Mark's body slammed into the metal, a sickening thud filling his ears. The air whooshed from his lungs, but his instincts kicked in, and he held his ground. Alicia cried out, her voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "Stop it." But it wasn't the plea that stopped the officer. It was the sound of her hand gently pressing against her swollen belly, eyes pleading. She was helpless, and the officer knew it. His cold gaze flickered to her before he turned back to Mark. "It's the world you get for existing here," the officer muttered, as if it was a lesson to be learned. Mark steadied himself, his breath ragged, hands pushing himself off the car. His heart pounded, each beat a thunderclap in his chest. "You don't have the right to." He was cut off. Another shove. The force pushed him back again. "Stop it, please." Alicia's voice cracked in the sudden storm of chaos, cutting through the officer's commands like glass breaking, but he didn't stop. For a split second, everything inside Mark froze. His thoughts spun. He could see Alicia, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, her pregnancy visible now in the soft light of the street. Mark could hear the blood roaring in his ears as he struggled against the mounting rage bubbling up, threatening to consume him whole. "Don't touch my wife," he grunted, trying to steady his breathing, though his body felt like it might explode at any moment. The second officer wasn't hearing it. His fist met Mark's chest. "Get back in your car," one officer ordered, the words cutting through the air with chilling finality. The world outside seemed like it didn't exist anymore, just this vicious back-and-forth battle. Alicia was crying now, silent, desperate sobs that made Mark's stomach twist, the strength in his heart faltering. Could he stop this? Could he protect them? He wasn't sure. And then it happened. It was like a trigger was pulled, another violent shove to his chest. Alicia's voice cracked with raw panic. "Mark, please don't fight them." But it was too late. The final words had been said. What followed would change everything. The officers saw themselves as above the law, but the truth, Mark hadn't given up, not yet. Mark ran his fingers through his hair, exhausted but determined. It had been a long day at the shop. The day's work had drained him, and yet, here he was, ready to face whatever came next. No complaints, no apologies, just work. The garage was small, tucked away on a quiet street, not far from where he and Alicia lived. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. That's what mattered most. He had never intended to be here, living a quieter life than the one he'd imagined. When he had joined the fire department, all he wanted was to help people, make a difference. He had the uniform, the skills, and a team that relied on him. He thought he'd be doing that for the rest of his life. But then, one false accusation, one moment where the wrong decision was made, and his whole life changed. That day had haunted him. The shame, the feeling of being betrayed by those he'd worked beside. There were always rumors when things went wrong, especially when lives were on the line. A miscommunication, a mistake that wasn't even his fault. They said he didn't follow protocol. They claimed he put others at risk, but Mark knew the truth. It wasn't him. It was something else, something nobody dared to say. But no one cared about the truth, not when a story could keep things neat. So he lost everything, his career, his dignity, and suddenly, it was just him against a world that seemed determined to knock him down. But Alicia had been there. She didn't leave, even after the accusations, even after the public scorn. Alicia, with her soft laughter that had once filled their small apartment with joy, had still believed in him. She was the anchor he clung to when everything else around him seemed to break apart. She stood by him in silence when the world wanted to talk about him behind his back. Alicia was always there, lifting him back up, reminding him who he really was: strong, capable, deserving. She never let him forget the fire in his heart. "It'll be okay," she said every night. "We'll get through this together." Her faith had kept him going when all he wanted to do was let everything fall apart. It wasn't easy. Rebuilding wasn't just about finding a new job or a new place. It was about reclaiming the person he'd lost, a man who believed he had something to fight for. Now, the shop wasn't just a place to work. It was a symbol of their new beginning, a place where he could start over. And then came the news: Alicia was pregnant. Mark's heart skipped a beat the day Alicia told him. It felt like everything shifted, like the universe pushed them toward a new chapter, one that couldn't just be about him anymore. It was about them. It was about the family they would become. Suddenly, all the hardship, the struggles, it was all worth it. They had something bigger than themselves now, a reason to fight even harder. But it wasn't easy. Their new life was filled with long hours, stress, and unexpected expenses. The garage wasn't bringing in enough money, and every month was a struggle to make ends meet. Alicia was trying to hold it together, but Mark could see the wear in her eyes, the weight she carried on her shoulders, and he felt it too. A sense of guilt creeping in, wrapping around his chest, whenever he saw the way she'd smile at him, trying so hard to reassure him that things were going to be all right. "We'll make it work," Alicia would say, squeezing his hand as they lay in bed, wide awake in the quiet darkness. But deep down, he wondered, how? How could they possibly make it work when everything was stacked against them, when every corner seemed just a little bit harder than the last? Then Alicia had a dream, a big dream. She wanted to open a childcare center, something to help kids who didn't have much. She had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunity was limited, and she remembered what it felt like not to have the resources to thrive. But she refused to let that become their story. She was determined to change things, to be a part of the solution, and she was going to make sure their child had everything they needed, even if the world didn't give it to them. Mark admired her for it, really, because in all honesty, he wasn't sure how much farther he could push himself. The thought of running a business, of investing in something so risky, made him anxious. But she believed in it. She believed they could make it work, and somehow, he couldn't let her do it alone. So, together, they began to plan, to dream. Alicia had begun working nights, networking, securing grants. She built a solid vision for the center, a place where families could bring their children while working multiple jobs, a safe haven for kids who deserved a fair shot at success. But the city wasn't making it easy. When you lived on the edge, as they did, getting that kind of help wasn't simple. Their application for funding was denied. There were hurdles at every corner, each more daunting than the last. But Mark, he was a fighter. Every time they hit a wall, he just came at it harder, no matter what, because that's how he'd been raised. When you don't have the luxury of quitting, you find another way. Alicia couldn't see it then, how much the weight of it all was crushing him, but he felt it, every single day. Even as his determination grew, so did the doubts. He questioned every decision. Every inch forward felt hard-won, as if the universe itself were conspiring against them. But Alicia, ever the optimist, didn't let him give up. With every smile, every bit of hope she gave, he pushed just a little bit farther. "You're the best mechanic I know," she'd say, her voice steady, certain. "We've got this." And maybe that was all they really needed. For Alicia, it wasn't just about what they wanted, it was about what they had to do. Because the stakes, They weren't just about a business. They weren't just about survival. They were about family. That night, as Mark worked in the garage long after dark, a sense of clarity washed over him. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. They had no choice but to fight. He looked at Alicia's photos pinned to the walls of the shop, her smiling face, her vision for a better life for their child, and he knew this was more than just a fight for them. It was for every child who had been passed over, for every family struggling against the same tides. Whatever came next, he wouldn't back down, not this time. The phone rang then, breaking his concentration. Alicia's number flashed on the screen, and just the sight of it made his heart race. He grabbed the phone, his hands shaking. "Alicia," he answered, the words faltering in his throat. Her voice, panicked, came through. "Mark, the police are." He didn't hear the rest of her words. The world narrowed, closing in on that one moment. The calm assurance of their new life was about to be shattered, and whatever came next, it wouldn't just be their future on the line anymore. Mark could feel the heat of the day burning into his skin as he walked towards the parking lot, Alicia close by, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. It was supposed to be a peaceful Saturday, a break from the chaos that had been their lives for the past few months. A quick trip to the grocery store was all they needed, but as they turned into the lot, a dark shadow seemed to stretch across their path. 3 police cruisers were parked near the entrance. Mark didn't pay much attention at first. It was an ordinary sight, a part of the neighborhood, until the officers stepped out. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a sneer on his face, locked eyes with Mark almost immediately. There was something off about the way he looked at them, something cold. The air, once warm with the afternoon sun, now felt suddenly heavy, suffocating. Mark felt a surge of unease shoot up his spine. Alicia, ever perceptive, noticed it too. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "Let's just grab what we need and leave, please." Mark nodded. It wasn't the first time they'd seen police officers in the area, but something about the tension in the air made this feel different. As they stepped towards the store, the officers were talking quietly among themselves, their eyes constantly flicking toward Mark and Alicia, scanning them. Mark's muscles tightened in anticipation. He had learned to recognize the way some officers watched people like him. It wasn't just policing, it was something darker. A power play, a quiet threat in their stance. Alicia squeezed his hand tighter. "Ada, her." "Hey," the officer called out, his voice like gravel, rough and aggressive. "You two belong here." Mark froze, surprised by the question. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Just shopping." The officer stepped closer, blocking their path. "I don't think so." His eyes flicked over Alicia, lingering too long before he finally turned back to Mark, his voice turning sharp, dangerous. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Mark could feel Alicia's breath hitch beside him. He looked at her, giving her a silent promise of protection. This was not the place, not today. "We're just here to shop, officer. Nothing more," he said, his words careful, though the resentment was growing in the pit of his stomach. He had been in the right. He had every right to be here. But it didn't matter. Nothing did when someone like this officer had already made up their mind about who belonged. The officer's gaze hardened, narrowing. "Doesn't look like you belong here. You've got a lot of nerve just walking in like this." Alicia spoke up before Mark could respond. "We've lived here for months. Please stop." "Shut up," the officer barked at her. "Keep your mouth shut unless you want a ticket to go along with that attitude." Mark moved instinctively, stepping closer to Alicia, shielding her as if that could ward off whatever danger hovered in the air. "We're not doing anything wrong, so how about you let us go on our way?" The officer sneered at him, his grip tightening on his belt. Wrong or right, doesn't matter. You know what's wrong. You're not respecting this community. You think you can just show up in places you don't belong and take what you want. Alicia, trembling now, said, "That's not what we're doing. We've never." "I don't care what you think," the officer yelled, his voice dripping with disdain, his chest puffed up with the pride of someone who felt too powerful, untouchable. "Get the hell out of here before I decide to deal with you differently." "Listen to me." Mark stepped forward, his voice shaking with quiet rage. "We're not moving. We're just getting groceries and leaving. We don't want trouble." Alicia's hand, cold now against his, gripped his tighter, trying to pull him back. She knew where this could lead. He wasn't listening though. The fear had already gripped him tightly, a quiet alarm warning him of the mess they were about to walk into. One of the other officers, shorter but built like a wall, smirked. "What, you think just 'cause you say you belong, that means you get to decide? You've got one foot in the wrong door." Mark shook his head, realizing then that they weren't going to get away from this easily. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Not like this, not today, not anymore." But before he could say anything else, a brutal shove knocked him to the ground. He didn't even see it coming. His body hit the hard concrete with a sickening thud, the breath knocked out of him. "Alicia, get back," Mark gasped, struggling to rise, but it was no use. The officer towered above him now, pinning him down with too much weight. He could barely breathe. Through the blur, Mark saw Alicia scream, her hands reaching for him, helpless. "Mark," she yelled. The officer stood there for a second, mocking him with a dark chuckle. "This is what happens when you don't learn your place." But the laughter didn't last long. Alicia, fueled by a sudden burst of bravery, shoved the officer away. "Get off him. Leave him alone." Her voice rang out in the tense air, a mixture of terror and defiance. But the officer wasn't interested in listening, not anymore. Without warning, he turned his attention to Alicia, shoving her hard against the shopping cart nearby. The impact sent her crashing to the ground. She groaned in pain, but before she could react, Mark exploded into motion. His heart thundered as his body moved on pure instinct, fueled by adrenaline and the terror of seeing her hurt. "Get your hands off her," Mark screamed, but the officer turned, grabbing Mark by the collar and jerking him back. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except making sure Alicia was okay. But it was clear, everything was spiraling beyond their control. Then the other officer moved in, placing his hand roughly on Alicia's shoulder. She winced from the pressure. Tears brimmed in her eyes, not just from the pain of being shoved, but from the helplessness in the situation. She couldn't move. She couldn't even protect herself. Mark watched this unfold with fire in his eyes. His jaw tightened, his vision blurred from the fury that rose in his chest. They had no reason for this. No reason at all. Not for anything they had done. That was when he heard it, the screeching of tires against the pavement, the sirens of a squad car suddenly pulling into the lot. Too many cops now. Way too many. This was the moment it broke. The stakes had never been so clear. This was no longer a misunderstanding or a minor altercation. This was the beginning of something bigger. The next few days felt like a blur to Mark. His mind raced from one thought to the next, but nothing seemed to make sense. Alicia kept encouraging him to keep pushing for justice, but something had shifted in him. The small acts of defiance, those brief moments where he thought he might be able to fight back, those had given him hope, but it wasn't enough. He wasn't stupid. He knew the system was broken, that all the documentation and pleas in the world wouldn't work unless he had something they couldn't ignore. So, he began looking for the cracks. He began digging into what Wade had been hiding. Alicia's voice became soft but insistent one night after another. "We need to do something, Mark. This won't go away on its own." But she was tired too. There were nights when Mark would hear her murmuring softly to herself, worried about everything that was happening around them. They had enough on their plates without becoming entangled in a larger, much more dangerous fight. And though he could see it in her eyes that she feared for him, she couldn't bear watching the world suffocate them. Mark didn't know how he got through the next few weeks. All he could focus on was collecting pieces, clips of footage, document leaks, anything that tied Wade's forces together. That's when Jacob stepped in. Jacob wasn't a family friend. He wasn't anyone special in Mark's circle, but he was a journalist who had always taken note of the inequities around town. He was one of the few who could see the systemic damage caused by corrupt officers and politicians. Jacob had quietly documented similar cases of abuse in different neighborhoods and had the scars from each of them. Mark didn't even have to explain his reasons. He saw the curiosity and burning anger in Jacob's eyes. "I've heard the rumors about Wade," Jacob said over the phone one late night after Mark had shared the basics of what had happened. "But this is different. Wade doesn't just hurt people. He makes them disappear. Quietly, one by one." Jacob promised to help. He was putting together the pieces, bit by bit, just as Mark was. Together, they started connecting names, faces, and a horrifying network of officers whose crimes had gone unpunished. But this wasn't the kind of thing you could publish on the front page without risking your life. Still, even with Jacob's help, every day felt like Mark was walking on a tightrope. He had no idea who might be watching or listening. Alicia's recordings from their encounters with Wade's officers had begun to accumulate, and though the fear weighed heavily on both of them, the footage was evidence. It couldn't be ignored forever. Alicia had become more resourceful in her attempts to gather any proof she could, setting up hidden cameras in their car, taking pictures when the cops tailed them down dark streets late at night. There were threats, more harassment, but the closer they came to revealing what Wade had hidden, the more the stakes rose. If Wade felt exposed, there would be no limit to the lengths he'd go to silence them. It wasn't until a restless night, long after the rest of the neighborhood had gone to sleep, that the breakthrough came. Mark sat in the small corner of their living room, staring at the pile of paperwork on the table, a stack of anonymous tip-offs, nothing that could be verified on its own. The pages seemed like so many jumbled pieces of a puzzle with no edges, no corners, just chaos. Then the email flashed on his phone. "Anonymous officer, Wade's going down. Meet me at dawn." No name, no explanation, just that single sentence. It didn't take long for the fear to set in. Mark didn't think twice before firing a message to Jacob, then setting out into the cold, empty streets. Alicia didn't sleep. She couldn't. The only sound in the quiet house was her rapid breathing as she paced, worrying about the dangerous road Mark had started down. When Mark arrived at the meeting point, an old diner that had long since closed down for the night, he saw a figure, dark against the morning haze. "I told you to stay back," the officer said softly, glancing over his shoulder nervously. The fear in the man's eyes was unmistakable, but so was the desperation. Wade's too far gone. The precinct's been covering for him. "I can't take your word for it," Mark said, voice laced with distrust. "You brought me here. What do you want?" The officer hesitated, eyes darting to the dark road behind them, making sure no one had followed him. "I need you to help me stop him. Wade's been silencing families. He's forcing people to move, or else they'd end up framed. The law? It's in his pocket. He runs things, and if you keep poking around, your names will be next." The officer looked straight into Mark's eyes. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you. I didn't want to bring this up. But I think it's time someone took him down. The city needs to know the truth." Mark had always prided himself on his calm, but tonight, his emotions were raw, tangled with everything else. He wanted justice, but at what cost? "What do you know about Wade?" Mark asked. The officer sighed, pulling out a folder from his jacket. "He has people watching every move you make. All I have is what's been smuggled out. You'll need to act fast." Mark's heart raced. As the officer passed the folder into his hands, the words "evidence" stamped on the front in thick red ink, Mark realized the cost of their silence. Alicia wasn't just a voice. She had caught something on video, pieces of the story that none of them had seen. The officer slipped away quietly before Mark could ask another word. He had done his part. Now it was up to Mark. For the first time, Mark felt like he had a chance to put an end to Wade's reign. There was a spark, one small glimmer of hope. Back at the house, Alicia was awake, waiting. She didn't ask questions as Mark dropped the folder onto the table. Her eyes searched his face, waiting for something to hold onto. "It's real," Mark said, barely above a whisper. His voice was hoarse, shaky. Alicia stared at the folder, then back at Mark. There was no hiding the raw emotion in her eyes, just a quiet, steady determination. "We can't back down now, Mark." The evidence, real footage of Wade's team protecting their own lives, was now in their hands. The scales had tipped, but Mark knew Wade wouldn't go down without a fight. He was on a collision course with everything they had, every ounce of courage and every moment of peace. What started as a personal battle for survival was quickly becoming something larger. They weren't just fighting Wade anymore. They were fighting a whole system that didn't care who they destroyed. It happened so quickly, Mark barely had time to process the impact. Alicia's voice trembled on the other end of the phone, sharp and frantic, the crackling tension in her breath enough to freeze his heart. "Mark," she whispered, barely audible. "It's happening. They're coming for us." He looked down at the evidence folder sitting in front of him on the kitchen table, the weight of the stack almost too much to bear. It was supposed to be their weapon, their redemption. Pictures, documents, proof of Wade's corruption, his dirty dealings with his precinct, and his brutality. Everything they needed to tear him down and start fresh. But now, as Alicia's voice reached him with those words, heavy with fear, Mark realized how little he really understood about the world they were about to face. He thought he had control. He thought the truth, once uncovered, would be enough. He had no idea how powerful Wade's web really was. "You've got to be careful," Mark whispered back. "They won't stop." Alicia's words were firm but brittle. "I know. We have to keep fighting. We can't stop now, not when we're this close." Mark leaned back in the chair, the cold reality hitting him harder than the anxiety ever could. He wasn't sure how much longer they could fight. Every step they'd taken toward justice felt like it had been matched by a threat twice as deadly. Threats not just against him, but against his family, against their dreams, against everything that mattered. Within days of sending their findings to a civil rights lawyer, the retaliation had begun. Fake charges were filed against Mark for obstruction and assault, charges built on lies. He was dismissed from the garage, his livelihood pulled out from under him just as fast as it had come. His pride and his fear swirled with each day that passed. What came next made him feel more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. Their car, the one they'd worked so hard to keep, was slashed, tires punctured, windows shattered. The angry message, written hastily in black spray paint across the hood, made it clear, "Stop or we'll stop you." That was the tipping point, the reminder that everything they'd faced had only been the beginning. Alicia couldn't leave the house alone anymore. She couldn't drive without feeling like someone was watching. The online threats escalated quickly. Anyone with a voice, anyone who might listen. suddenly had an opinion on Alicia's strength, but it wasn't kindness they offered. The internet turned hostile, spewing threats about what would happen to her and their unborn child if they didn't back off. Mark sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window as Alicia paced behind him, desperate and determined not to let herself show the full depth of her fear. But this was bigger than anything they had ever fought. "Maybe we need to think about pulling back," he said, the words like stones in his mouth. "I'm not talking about quitting, but pulling back. For your safety. The risks, they're too high now." Alicia froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What did you just say?" His voice broke through the tension that thickened the room. "It's too much, Alicia. What if they come for you next? I can't lose you. I can't lose our baby." Her hands tightened into fists, and for a second, Mark thought she might break under the pressure. Then, her eyes turned hard with defiance. "We can't stop fighting, Mark," she said quietly, each word weighing 1,000 pounds. "We can't. Not when it's this close to breaking, not when it can make a difference. We can't let fear stop us. It's what they want. If we stop now, they win. They'll win everything." She stepped closer to him, her voice rising, filled with passion and fear in equal measure. "You taught me that. Remember? You always said we can't give up, no matter what. So we push forward. We fight back." Tears blurred his vision, but Mark didn't wipe them away. He couldn't. She was right. They had made it this far, not just for their sake, but for others too. They had found something worth holding onto. And then Alicia's phone rang, a sudden sharp noise in the quiet. They both glanced at it, as if it had some kind of omen, both terrified and curious. She picked it up immediately. It was Jacob. His voice was frantic on the other end. "Alicia, I don't know how much longer we can hide this. Wade's too deep in it, but we've got something. There's someone inside." Alicia's grip on the phone tightened, her eyes locking with Mark's, confusion and curiosity flashing over her face. "Someone inside?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "Yeah, an officer. He doesn't want to stay silent anymore, but we've got to act fast. They're covering their tracks harder than I thought. They've found out that you know what you have, and now they're more dangerous than ever." The desperation in Jacob's voice was enough to make Alicia's breath catch. "What are you saying?" "We have evidence, Jacob. Proof that he's corrupt." "I know," Jacob responded, low and urgent. "But they're closing in. We need to go public. Now, not later. But we'll need people behind you. Real people." Real people. Alicia turned to Mark, her eyes holding a fierce, unflinching resolve. "This is it, Mark. The only way to stop Wade is if we go public now. We have the proof." "We have enemies," he whispered hoarsely, "and they've got more power than we do." His fear gripped him like a vice, but Alicia didn't hesitate. "And we have our story, Mark, our truth." Her words slammed into him like a floodgate breaking open. This wasn't about just them anymore. This was bigger than just Mark and Alicia. This wasn't even just about justice for what had happened to them. This was about exposing what Wade had done to everyone, about letting the world know, to hold someone like him accountable. But the danger, the possibility of losing everything still loomed over them. Alicia dialed the number, speaking to Jacob again, arranging their next steps. The hour that followed felt like an eternity as Mark sat in the stillness of the room, everything racing through his mind. Their home, their safety, their future. Minutes later, they were on the road, heading to a local council meeting where Alicia would testify about everything they'd uncovered. She didn't back down. Neither of them did. The moment she stood at that podium and spoke into the microphone, Mark's heart surged with both pride and fear. But what followed wasn't just a speech. It was an uprising. Every word she spoke held the weight of the fight they had carried for so long, the hope they had finally found to break this system down. Her story spread like wildfire. The video from the council meeting, her bold, unwavering testimony, went viral, and people began to listen. The community, first fragmented and unsure, now started rallying around them. Calls for action echoed across every corner. Emails, text messages, all showing support. They were no longer alone. But even as the weight of their truth began to lift, the stakes grew higher. Wade wouldn't let it end this way, not without a fight. And soon, Mark and Alicia would realize that the war they were fighting wasn't just against a corrupt officer. It was against a system that would do anything to keep its power intact. The court was packed. Every seat in the room was filled with people, whispers darting across the air like sharp blades of anticipation. Mark stood at the back, eyes glued to the scene unfolding before him, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. This was it, the moment everything hinged on, the moment they would take everything they had fought for and place it on the table for all to see. At the front, Alicia sat stiffly, her eyes wide, but every inch of her, every muscle in her body, radiating a quiet fury. She was ready. She had been ready long before now. But as her eyes scanned the room, catching a glance at Wade sitting in his suit, sprawled across the defense table with that smug smile plastered on his face, the weight of it hit her again. They had pushed him, cornered him. This was the showdown, and it was about to get ugly. She was used to fear now. She had made peace with it. She had learned to push it down, bury it under layers of truth. But when she looked at him now, Wade, the man who had been behind it all, something inside of her shifted. "You're not going to win," she whispered under her breath, just loud enough for Mark to hear, though there was no one left to convince. He already knew. The bailiff announced their case with all the usual formalities, but the moment Wade's lawyers stood up to defend him, the atmosphere seemed to shift like a heavy fog rolling in. Mark's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't keep the rage in check. Wade had threatened them, harassed them. He'd ruined their lives. And now, in this very room, he was trying to downplay the violence he had caused. Alicia couldn't even hear them anymore. All she could hear, all she could feel, was the weight of the footage that had become the linchpin of their defense, the images that had spread across every social media platform, shocking the nation into a frenzy. Everything had changed once the video hit the internet. People couldn't unsee what Alicia had captured. There were too many people with the same story, too many people who had witnessed the brutal violence of Wade's reign. That one clip of her being thrown to the ground, that single moment of unprovoked aggression in front of the world, it went viral, and the city of Charleston woke up, but they weren't the only ones watching. The national outcry was deafening. Headlines, news stations, live streams. R.A.C.I.S.T police captain exposed, shocking video, read one headline. Wade thought he had been invincible, but this was something different. In the courtroom, Mark's breath hitched as he saw Wade shift uncomfortably in his chair, his previously stoic demeanor cracking under the weight of public exposure. His chest tightened when he thought about all the faces, all the names, all the families that had been crushed in the wake of his brutality. But now, Mark and Alicia were here, fighting back, and Wade was no longer a kingpin, no longer above it all. At all. As Alicia took the stand, she breathed deeply, steadying herself, knowing that every word that passed her lips would either topple this house of lies or solidify it forever. "I'm not here to beg for justice," Alicia said, her voice cutting through the tension in the courtroom. "I'm here because we deserve it. Every person out there who has had to hide, live in fear, stay quiet. This is for them. For every single one of us who has been silenced. You have no idea what you've done." She paused, looking at Wade directly. It was then that Mark noticed it, the tiny flicker in Wade's eyes, the way his posture stiffened, the subtle hesitation before his lawyer whispered something into his ear. For the first time, Mark allowed himself to truly believe they could win. Everything they had been through, the harassment, the threats, the personal cost, it was all leading to this. But Wade had the money. He had the system. And there was still a lingering doubt, one that he couldn't shake. Would it be enough? And as Alicia continued, everything that Wade had done began to unravel like fragile string. "You can hide behind your badge," she said. "You can pretend the law doesn't mean anything to you. But I'm here to tell you, we won't stop. We won't back down." But it wasn't just Alicia's words that held the room in rapt silence. It was the energy in the room, the unseen power shifting as more people aligned with them. A former officer who had been forced to quit the force due to Wade's bullying took the stand next. Their story wasn't just a solo account anymore, it was a pattern, a collective fight. Mark stood to the side, barely aware of the pit in his stomach, as the narrative he had lived for so long unfolded in front of him. Every injustice, every cover-up, they were all laid bare. But what hit hardest wasn't the confession of Wade's cruel practices. It wasn't even his involvement with shady dealings. What struck hardest was the impact, the utter indifference Wade had for those lives. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't regretful. He still believed he could get away with it. Even as the noose tightened, Mark could see it in Wade's eyes, the same sneering confidence that had belittled him before. It was time to finish this, time to make sure he never hurt anyone again. Then, in the middle of the hearing, Alicia collapsed. One moment, she was speaking with clarity, the next she was crumbling, her body swaying before she dropped to the floor, unable to keep standing. Mark's heart stopped, his world shattering as he pushed through the crowd, desperate to get to her. Alicia, look at me," he shouted, feeling the panic course through him as he knelt beside her, trying to rouse her. The courtroom was still, silent except for the distant thudding of Mark's own heart. "I'm fine," Alicia mumbled weakly, still disoriented. I just need a moment, Mark. I'm not quitting." She was barely breathing, but the fire in her eyes, the one that never wavered, reminded Mark of everything she had sacrificed, everything they had fought for. He wouldn't let this end now. The crowd of witnesses gasped in concern, but Alicia waved them off, her strength surging through the fog of exhaustion. But Mark was no longer just protecting her. Now, he had to protect everyone. Every life Wade had touched. With Alicia's collapse, the tension in the room morphed into a fervent frenzy. Wade tried to gather himself, to make sense of what was happening, but it was too late. The evidence spoke for itself. The papers, the witnesses, Alicia's words, before the world had seen her fall. The pieces were finally falling into place, and Wade knew there was no escape. Mark stood, his own body trembling but resolute. He turned to face the jury, eyes sharp as glass. "This man," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "this man used his position to instill fear. He ruined families. He thought he could intimidate us, and he thought he could intimidate all of you." Mark paused, letting the silence hang heavy. The weight of truth, and the collective power of those who supported them, hung in the air. "I'm not asking for revenge," Mark continued, his voice steady now. "I'm asking for justice. For every family who has been trampled, for every person whose voice has been stolen, for my wife, for my child, for every life this man thought he could crush under his boots." The courtroom shifted. There was no longer room for doubt, no longer any chance of survival for Wade. The courthouse doors slammed open. Mark and Alicia stood, hand in hand, the weight of their journey finally reaching its destination. Justice. They could feel it in the air, heavy as a storm before the first drop of rain. It wasn't just about them anymore. It wasn't even about winning. It was about something far greater, making sure no one would ever go through what they had again. And as they stood there, in the heart of a nation watching, their world changed forever. Inside the courtroom, everything had shifted. The officers who had stood with Wade, smug and untouchable just weeks ago, now shifted uneasily in their seats. One by one, they were forced to face their lies and crimes. The trial had been long, brutal, but with every twist, every revelation, the truth had chipped away at the walls of corruption. Wade had never been so vulnerable. But it wasn't just the officers on trial. It was everything they represented. A system so deeply rooted in abuse, in silence. They thought they could erase people's voices. They thought no one would ever fight back. But Mark and Alicia were proof that change was possible. Mark held Alicia's hand, tighter now, as her speech echoed in his mind. Her words had become a rallying cry, breaking through every barrier of fear and doubt. She had walked to that podium, vulnerable and strong at the same time. "We are here," she had said, her voice unwavering despite the exhaustion. "Not because we seek revenge, but because this must never happen again. Our children deserve better. Every family deserves better. We cannot remain silent, even when the world pushes us to stay quiet." The press had been relentless. The footage that Alicia had captured, every painful, heartbreaking second, played on repeat, becoming the fire that fueled public outcry. Calls for Wade's resignation came flooding in. The story spread like wildfire across every news outlet, bringing more voices into the conversation. People of all walks of life, Black, white, Latino, Asian, had heard what happened, and they wouldn't let the system bury it. In the courtroom, as Wade's lawyers tried in vain to protect him, the dam finally broke. One after another, witnesses came forward, civilians, former officers, even members of the police union, each one turning their back on the corruption they had long refused to see. It wasn't just Wade. It was a culture of fear, of hatred, embedded in a force meant to protect. Then, the moment Mark had prayed for arrived. Guilty. The word cut through the room, clear as daylight, and the sound of it rang in Mark's ears. Wade's smug arrogance crumbled in an instant. His whole life, his whole grip on power, slipping through his fingers. The courtroom held its breath as the judge handed down the sentence, sealing his fate. The officers who had once stood behind him, now visibly shaken, shared in his downfall. Convictions for assault, harassment, abuse of power. The truth could no longer be ignored. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Mark felt something inside of him shift. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief. It was vindication. He had done it. They had done it. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every tear Alicia had shed, it had been worth it. They had stood against the system, and they had broken it. Not in violence, not in revenge, but in truth. And then the silence that had filled the courtroom was shattered by Alicia's voice. "This doesn't end here," she declared. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she turned toward the crowd of reporters and activists who had gathered. "This is the first step toward changing everything, the first step toward rebuilding trust, but we can't do this alone." She turned to Mark, a proud smile breaking across her face. "We do this for our family. We do this for the future, for every parent, for every child who deserves to grow up in a world without fear." The crowd erupted into applause, and Mark, his heart racing, finally allowed himself to believe it. They had made it, but the fight wasn't over. It would never be over until there were no more voices silenced. Later, standing together outside the courthouse, Mark and Alicia took in the sight of a crowd now rallying around them. People who had seen their struggle, who had joined their fight. For the first time, Mark didn't feel the weight of loneliness that had followed him for so long. Alicia's dream was alive now. The child center she had longed to create, one that would give marginalized children the resources and safety they needed to thrive, would soon open its doors. The dream was no longer just a hope, it was their new reality. But even as they rejoiced, Mark's mind kept turning. The victory, though it felt monumental, was only a beginning. It was about creating a new path, one where no officer could ever hide behind their badge again, one where people like Wade were held accountable. Mark had learned something through this battle, that there was power in his voice, and in Alicia's. Together, they would never stop speaking for those who couldn't. Days later, Mark walked the streets with Alicia by his side, watching as people began to speak out, as communities rallied together. They stood in front of their building, now being transformed into Alicia's Child Center, their center. There would be hope for the future here, hope for all the kids who would never know the fear that had shadowed Alicia and Mark. Mark could hardly believe it. Just months ago, he had felt so broken, so powerless. Now, he was something he'd never thought he could be, unbowed, a force for change. His steps felt lighter than they ever had before. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who'd been told their lives didn't matter, everyone who'd been told their voices couldn't make a difference. "I can't believe how far we've come," Alicia said, standing next to him, the wind playing with her hair, a vision of strength and grace. Mark pulled her close, looking out over the crowd now assembling for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, for the future they would build together. It was all worth it. Everything, the blood, sweat, and tears, had led to this moment. "Yes," he whispered, a fierce pride igniting in his chest. "We're just getting started." The gymnasium was packed, every seat filled with parents, students, teachers, and the media. There was an electricity in the air, the kind that came with a historic moment, a turning point, not just for one family, but for an entire community. Standing on the stage, Sophia, Mark and Alicia's daughter, gripped the microphone, her heart racing. She wasn't afraid, not really. She had been preparing for this speech for years, watching how her parents fought, how they turned their pain into something powerful. Today, she wasn't just their daughter. She was their legacy. She looked out at the crowd, searching for the familiar faces, her father sitting front row, proud but calm, her mother, who had never shown her the weight of fear, but had fought with all her heart, her eyes now filled with love. It was almost impossible for Sophia to imagine her life without them, without the lessons they taught her about standing up, about truth, about love. Her fingers tightened around the microphone, and her voice broke the heavy silence. "I stand here today because of the sacrifices my parents made. They didn't just fight for us." Sophia's voice faltered for a brief moment as she held back tears. They fought for everyone who didn't have a voice, for the people whose stories were buried, for families like ours, who were told we didn't belong. She paused, looking out over the sea of people. The crowd, made up of every race, every walk of life, was hanging on every word. "My parents showed me how to turn my anger into purpose," Sophia continued. "They showed me that the world doesn't just change because you demand it. Sometimes, you have to become the change. I know this, because I saw them do it. I saw them stand up, even when it was hard, even when they were afraid." The crowd was with her now, nodding, acknowledging the hard truth she was speaking. Sophia's words were raw, ripped from the deep roots of pain and pride. This wasn't a textbook lesson. This wasn't scripted. It was real. Every syllable she spoke echoed her parents' courage, their resilience, their refusal to back down. Sophia swallowed, pushing past the lump in her throat. "You see, there are so many stories just like ours, stories of injustice, of fear, of helplessness. But my parents taught me that we have power, no matter who tries to take it away. They didn't just survive, they changed things. They proved that truth, no matter how hard, always has a way of getting out. A ripple went through the crowd. The memories of what had happened, the protests, the viral footage of her mother's testimony, the courtroom showdown, flashed in Sophia's mind like a reel of photos. She had seen it all through her parents' eyes, learned from their every victory, their every failure. "They fought so that no one would forget," she said softly, "so that one day, their child could stand in front of people like you, in front of everyone who believed in them, and say thank you. Thank you for not letting them be erased. Thank you for giving me this platform. Thank you for making sure the world never forgets that we all belong." Sophia's words were not just a tribute, they were a promise. A promise that this fight, the fight her parents had started, would continue. "The fight didn't end with my parents' victory," Sophia said, her voice steady and strong. "It started the moment they decided to change the world, and now, it's up to all of us. Every generation that comes after them, after all the progress they made, has a responsibility. We carry their stories with us. We carry the struggles, but we also carry their hope." She paused, the gravity of her words sinking in. Sophia wasn't just recounting the past, she was inspiring the future, setting her sights on the world she would build, a world where Mark and Alicia's fight wasn't forgotten, but was instead the foundation of every victory to come. A hush fell over the crowd as Sophia turned toward her parents, who were standing now, eyes glistening, a smile tugging at Alicia's lips. They had given so much, and here, their daughter, everything they fought for, was offering it all back. "I'm proud to be my parents' daughter," she said with pride that filled the room, "and I'm proud to stand here as proof of the difference they made. We all have a story, but we also have the power to change it." The room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, shouting in support, in recognition of the woman who had spoken, the woman who had taken her parents' strength and multiplied it with every word she spoke. As Mark and Alicia made their way to the stage to hug their daughter, tears stunned their eyes. It was the same fight, the same dedication, but a new chapter. A new generation ready to carry it forward. Their dream of a future full of hope and resilience had bloomed right before their eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart," Mark whispered, his hand over hers as she stood beside him. "You did it." She smiled up at him, her pride in her parents matched only by their pride in her. And in that moment, in that brief pause before the applause died down, they all felt it, the weight of what they had done, of the future they had built. They had not just created a change, they had created a legacy. A legacy that no one would ever be able to erase. It was justice, it was redemption, and it was just the beginning.